Any further discussion on the agenda? All those opposed, say aye. Motion carries. You have the minutes of the previous meeting of March 25th. Are there any corrections or additions to those minutes? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
John Strand, I move approval.
Thank you, John. Is there a second?
Bob Zimmerman, second.
Thank you, Bob. All those opposed to approving the minutes, say aye. Thank you. Okay, right on to item number 4. As most of you know, we are having a joint meeting today with Public Outreach. Roger Olson is the chair of that group, and we just thought this might be a little more efficient. Big, important topic today, several of them actually, but we're going to kick off here with NDSU's Ag Risk Prevent Plant study, and I will just let NDSU take away. Thank you so much.
Hey guys, this is Eric. Just a couple introductory comments, and then I'll ask Dean and his team to take over as well. In your packet is on page 6 and 7 is the, I guess we call it a one-pager. It ends up being 2 pages, but a informational sheet regarding the base study that the NDSU team presented last month. And so I wanted you to make sure you are aware of that. And then in addition, the presentation that the NDSU group gave last month is on the project website, as well as the video recording of their presentation. And we will also get today's presentation and recording on the project website as well. With that, I think I'll probably just turn it over to Dean and Salim and Nancy from NDSU. And I think you guys hopefully are able to just share your screen and proceed with your presentation.
Is my screen up now?
I'm not seeing it yet.
Okay. So I click on the share button, correct?
Yep, and then you should be able to, so there you go. There you go.
We're live. Great, great. All right, thanks, Eric. And I hope everyone is doing well and staying COVID free in these crazy and weird times. But joining me today is 2 other members of the research team, as Rick mentioned, Dr. Salim Sheikh and Dr. Nancy Hoder, who have also been involved in this process since the inception about 5 years ago. As Eric mentioned, we discussed one of the 2 big research questions that we were addressed to look at last time, and that was producer revenues. That was presented in the March meeting. I think we went over a lot of material in that presentation because there was a lot of stuff that goes into understanding how that study was designed and what the outcomes of that were. Part of what we're doing today is an offshoot of that. We're going to focus on prevent plant. I'm hoping that the presentation today will be much shorter than it was the last meeting, and that we'll have an opportunity for questions and comments. And while we included the revenues, lost revenues to producers if they were forced into a prevent plant situation as a result of the diversion, the revenues were included, but we didn't really articulate or define the acreage, or for that matter, the inputs that would not be purchased as a result of that. So the analysis that we're talking about today really has a focus on the egg supply sector and really what the addition of having more PP in the staging area would mean for those businesses that are actively supplying inputs to producers that are operating in that area. We have a generalized set of producer decisions that are part of the modeling that we're doing. Obviously, this is a complex set of decisions that every producer goes through. The economics of those decisions vary by producer, vary based on insurance provisions and such. But in general, producers go through a period where they can obtain optimal yields if they can get the crop planted in a certain point in time in the spring. Then as they progress outside of that window, their yields will start to decline. Ultimately, they come to a point in the planting period where they have to make a decision on whether they want to continue to plant the crop that they're planting at a substantially increased yield loss, or switch that crop to another crop that is more suited to being planted at that point in time, or claim PP, PP meaning prevent plant. And so we have dates in the analysis that correspond with federal crop insurance provisions, and they're specific to the region that we're dealing with. So we don't have a distribution around all kinds of what ifs with producer decisions. We're forcing all the decisions on PP and switching crops to follow the same set of guidelines. So just a little backdrop on where we're coming from with what we pulled together for this study. All of the output that we're using here comes from the simulation modeling that was covered in fairly good detail in the last meeting. We did add a database that looks at input costs from actual producer records. That's important. That data is not an estimate, but actual production records. And we're really looking at probably showing you 3 sets of output today. Acreage of prevent plant that the diversion is contributing to, the value of those production inputs that would not be purchased on those lands, and changes in crop volume coming out of the staging area. So this slide looks busy. Basically, all it is to simplify the analysis and eliminate a lot of the tweaking that would go with this or that type of a adjustment. Essentially, if any part of the staging area is flooded, we're assuming it's all flooded. We didn't include land rent in this analysis. We figured that is something that would be uniquely negotiated between tenants and landowners. We didn't account for any pre-purchase of inputs prior to the spring planting season. No weed control or cover crop requirements on the prevent plant acres. Those expenses would of course offset some of the lost inputs if the land did not get planted to a crop. We're not including any of the acreage that's lost to the diversion infrastructure. That's another issue that we of course did not address here. There's one storage area in this staging area that we excluded, and that has to do with the hydrology. The big issue that is hard to quantify is the crop insurance sales that would be foregone within the staging area, and the sales that would be lost on acres that cannot be planted. Suffice to say, there's a lot of eligibility issues here that we're uncertain of. There's a lot of coverage issues. So we took a very limited look at this. Obviously, this is an issue that will probably be revisited when and if the provisions for that type of coverage become better defined. So we have 3 scenarios with this analysis. The baseline is the treatment that you guys received last month, and that means that corn and wheat acres not planted by May 31st, that's our switch date, 20% of those acres would become PP and 80% would be switched to soybean. The reason for some of that being PP is we recognize not all lands are going to be available to plant at that switch date, and in some cases, some lands would not be suitable for planting to soybean. All the sugar beet acres get planted, so we're not dealing with that. There's no switch crop for soybeans. Soybean acres not planted by June 10 go to PP, and that's according to federal crop insurance guidelines. If we look at the scenario 2 and scenario 3, we enter into a little more pessimistic framing of this question. We're assuming there's no switch crop for corn and wheat. So if they don't get it planted by May 31st, it all goes to PP. So that's the difference between 1 and 2. And then 3 is kind of a worst case scenario where there's no switch crop for corn and wheat. All of those acres go to PP. And if it's too risky for producers to try to raise sugar beets on those lands that are flooded, we're modeling that sugar beet acreage to be displaced someplace else, and corn and soybeans would be raised on those acres. and those acres would be treated just like all the other corn and soybean acres. So that being said, we've got 3 conditions. We're going to focus on the condition 2 and 3 in the results. So if we look at prevent plant acreage, what you see here is we have the 10 flood sizes that we're evaluating, and we went over that in fairly strong detail a month ago. And then we have a 25th percentile worst case and a 5% worst case. These are based on the number of simulations that we ran with the modeling that we developed. And you can see here that when we get to the larger floods is when we start seeing a noticeable increase in the amount of PP acreage that's caused by the diversion. Not to be mistaken with the total amount of PP, because that's a different issue, and we're only looking at on the margin how much additional acreage is created by the operation of the staging area. Relatively low amounts of acreage, and these numbers here are very consistent with what we talked about a month ago regarding kind of the lining up of when the lands would be ready to plant and when the effects of flooding are largely over. So translating those acres into lost crop production inputs, this is from the perspective of the egg supply people, the businesses that are providing fertilizer, chemical, seed, some custom work. A lot of it comes from your local elevators and dedicated firms. Here you can see that on the scale here of the amount of dollars that are foregone, that producers are not going to purchase as a result of not being able to plant those acres. We see the big spike again as we get to those bigger, longer, deeper, stronger, bigger floods, but not so much with the smaller floods. And that again is going to be directly linked back to what we're finding out with the acreage. So what's the way that we could put this into context and try to figure out, we know the dollar amounts, but is that a lot? Is it not a lot? If we looked at the staging area and let's just say that it was corn, wheat, and soybeans, we're going to exclude the discussion for sugar beets because they're going to get planted because most of those acres are under contract. So those inputs will be purchased. So if we assume that it was just those 3 crops for all those acres, we're looking at 18 to 20 million in input purchases to put those crops in the ground and for the expenses that go with harvesting and raising a crop for a full season. The worst case scenario is that we're looking at about 400,000 in lost inputs. That's about 2% of the total inputs that would be purchased from lands in the staging area. One of the things that we're trying to help people understand is that if the crops are switched, there is a slight trade-off there between, for example, corn and soybeans, but the inputs that you would have purchased for corn now get substituted for soybeans, and that's why in that first scenario that we identified, we're really not seeing much at all of any consequence to lost inputs in that scenario. But of course, the numbers start increasing when we eliminate the ability to switch crops. So looking at the range of lost production, this has a bearing for your local elevators, grain handling systems. We didn't estimate a margin for those crops, but those firms can look at this and take a feel for that themselves. But we can see that there is a sensitivity between the 10-day dry down and the 14-day dry down. That's something we discussed last month, that is showing up. You can see here the number of bushels, anywhere from less than 50,000 up to 300,000, depending on the scenario. And you can kind of see the sensitivity on some of these floods when we go from the top 25th percentile worst cases to the 5% worst cases. That we're seeing a little more responsiveness in the model there to the amount of grain that's not going to get produced in the staging area. So what's the relative effect of that? Can we put that into context? If we eliminated sugar beets again to make this a simpler, more conceptually consistent analysis, we're looking at about 5.7 million bushels. That would be corn, wheat, and soybeans coming from the staging area using current yields, assuming no major planting delays. This is a absent of the diversion type of condition. The amount of grain production that's going to be foregone, and that's a combination of lands that are prevented from being planted and yield reductions on lands that are delayed. So it's a combination of both those factors. Anywhere from 20 to 100,000 bushels. Again, that's a 0.5 to about a 2% change in the amount of grain volume coming out of the staging area. When we look at worst case conditions, we're upping that by several factors, but even at that point, 300,000 bushels, we're looking at a reduction of 5 to 6%. Again, this is only due to diversion. We know that there will be additional reductions in flood years, but remember that we're identifying just what we think is attributable to the diversion. So here's maybe more in line with what I'm suggesting with that concept is this is actual prevent plant acreage for corn. The blue bars are Cass and Richland County in North Dakota. The orange bars are Clay and Wilkin. And you can see here that this is the percent of land dedicated to that crop acreage in the county. In other words, what's the crop rotation percentage? It's based on how many total acres there are, and then what share of those acres didn't get planted. You can see that we don't need to know what the share of corn is. I think it's around 40% or 35% in the counties. Lots of acres that didn't get planted in those flood years of 2009 through 2011. Another condition in 2014, and another large condition last year. And then you can see here what the average is. So suffice to say, large flood years are going to produce a lot more PP than what we're modeling, only because of the way that we're looking at measuring it. We're just looking at the additional incremental amount that comes from the diversion. This is the same graph looking at soybeans. And again, this would make a lot of sense. Soybeans are planted much later in the season. Producers are willing to put those in, at a point when the yield reductions are less severe, less of a decline than they would with other crops. So if the producers are in a position where they don't have PP insurance, or alternatively, if the economics for that producer favor planting another crop, those are factors that will adjust these. But even looking at that, we have very small amounts of acreage dedicated to soybeans that don't get planted. And the PP provisions there, most of that would not get planted is due to moisture. We're not looking at other claims to crop insurance losses. So summarize, and then we can open this up to some questions and discussion. I did not want to do a repeat of the lengthy presentation last time. I wanted everyone to have a chance to kind of weigh in. Under average spring planting conditions, really the diversion is not producing a substantial increase in PP. In the worst 5% of those simulations, when we look at a 500-year flood, that's a very low probability of occurring. We see, an additional 1,000 acres of PP coming in as a result of the diversion. In those most diverse conditions, I think it's suffice to say we could start talking at the 2% level and go up and down from there. And there's a larger range of effects on grain volumes because we're again including not just the lands that are prevented from growing a crop, but lands that are growing that have yield reductions because they were put in late. And so that is kind of a neat and tidy little summary of the PP analysis. We have a full report that's available that details in far more scrutiny than we put in here. I do have all of the slides appended that we went over last time. If there is issues that we brought up in the previous presentation that people have a question on or something, we have all the materials available. And I guess we hopefully between the 3 team members, we can answer any questions you guys might have.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Who's got a question? Roger, have you got anything you'd like to throw into the mix?
Well, I think it's very complete, Dean. Your team has, I think, captured what I wanted to see from a farmer standpoint, and really a little surprising that we're not seeing a bigger percentage of losses, but we have to rely on the inputs that were put into your models and believe those.
I think one of the concerns there, Roger, is that we've limited this analysis to a 14-day dry down period, and if there are going to be conditions when perhaps that's not realistic, that would evidently push those lands further into the spring, and we might see an increase. Unfortunately, we can't model that as a number that varies like we did the other ones. If we go to a slide that we presented before, we're really still working with this particular environment here where these two periods really coincide pretty closely. And if we want to see a bigger influence of the diversion, we have to have conditions that either extend the flood further into the spring or things that change when the producers can get in the field. And that's driven by the data. And so right now, what we're seeing is a very strong result from the data we have. If that data changes, we of course would potentially have a much different set of conclusions.
Dean, could you explain the 25-year flood and why that's showing a little more impact than maybe even the 100-year?
Yes. One of the conditions that we modeled with the hydrology data is the duration of the flood. In other words, how long the flood actually lasts, as opposed to the overall peak magnitude of water. And the 25-year extra long flood is more synonymous with the 1997 flood. And as a result, that was a flood that, we didn't see peak flows like we did in 2009, but what we did see was we saw flows that were large enough to operate the diversion for several weeks. So in that case, the 25-year long and 25-year extra long is representative of a change in the duration of the flood and not the overall size or peak flow.
See, this is Eric. Maybe just one more comment on that. Obviously, every flood is unique, and we've all been through several of them. But looking at the hydrograph from the 97 flood, it's quite a bit different than most of our flood events. And that different shape of the hydrograph, I think, is what's being pointed out here in that 25-year EL, meaning extra long, which was again modeled after the 97 flood. And so, that goes to show that the duration of the flood have some impact on planting dates, of course. But keep in mind that the hydrograph for the 2009 flood was, while every flood is unique, the 2009 flood was sort of extraordinarily unique because of the shape of the hydrograph.
One additional clarification on that, Eric, is that we did go back to the hydrology modelers and say that, are the results that we're seeing from our modeling consistent with the hydrology that was present in 2009? I think most of us had the memory of a rather quick and high peak in Fargo, but the hydrology shows that there was actually a second peak, a second crest that came through. And for some of the lands, that kept the producers out of the field based on the way we were modeling, and that extended that opportunity to plant way into the spring. And so we're seeing, more meaningful impacts with a 2009 like flood because of that second crest. And that's again, a unique hydrology based factor in the modeling. And so if we have a flood of any size where we have a quick flush and then we have another subsequent surge that comes later, we'll see much larger effects from a flood like that than we would a flood that goes through builds up and then drops down and then everything else gets a chance to dry out.
So isn't that more typical though, to have that second crest? Am I mistaken?
Well, I think that's a question for the engineers and the hydrologists, and those that are studying those issues. To what extent that second crest is going to be a prevalent problem, how often that occurs. That if we look at the flow data, there are in some cases crests, or I should say, points in time when the floodwaters go down and come back up. But there was only the one flood where when the waters came back up that they were high enough to keep the diversion staging area active. And so some of that is a function of, how much of a second increase are we seeing? And then at what point in the spring did that second increase show up?
And then I know we've had some conversation about June events or summer events. Was that analyzed in this particular case or not? I would think that my guess would be that it would be kind of a moot point, but I'm just wondering where you're at with that.
Well, there's obviously the possibility that a sequence of unforeseen events in June or July would result in perhaps the need to use the diversion. That hasn't occurred historically yet. We did not model that, but my understanding is, and maybe members of the land committee or Eric could weigh in on this, is that there have been acknowledged that there would be a provision put forth for the producers that if the staging area was operated in the summertime after the crop was planted, that would be handled on a case-by-case basis. We don't have any data to model that. It's never happened before, but the hydrologists tell us that just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't. So it is something worth noting. It's of course not anything that we modeled with this effort.
Dean, this is Roger again. I do have a question about the impact of on your data of if 1 acre gets backed up water on it from the diversion, the whole staging area was considered used. How does that impact the data?
Well, the data that we got from the hydrologists broke the movement of water in terms of when it showed up and when it went down by staging area. But when they model the staging area, the water shows up in a lot of these cases, does not encompass the entire storage area. So if we were to use only actual acres that were inundated and not the storage area, we would have a smaller footprint. However, the problem with that is that you and I both know that ownership among those staging areas or those storage areas could be multiple landowners, and we don't know if that affects one producer or affects all the producers, or if that affects access to land that cannot be accessed that's ready to plant. And so without a lot of more complicating type of detail, it was the safest, most conservative estimate to say, if you had some flooding on that storage area, we're going to assume all of that land is not ready to plant. In reality, that may or may not be true, depending, of course, on the natural topography of the land, the size of the flood. If all of the land's owned by one landowner or multiple landowners, all that factors into all those variations that could take place.
So in effect, it's actually was conservative actually in giving maybe more or higher level of damage because more acres were considered to be flooded?
Well, if we were to assume that all of the unflooded land could be planted, that would probably be true. But we know that there are going to be cases where 2/3 of a field is planted and the farmer's not going to want to try to go in and plant a small portion of that until the rest of the field can get dried out. There are those producer decisions that we can't account for. Access to that storage area, maybe the access to that field is underwater and parts of the other field isn't. It is a more conservative approach, but without having definitive boundaries within the storage area to identify those tracts of land that could be accessed by another producer that isn't going to wait for the rest of his land to dry out, it's really hard to separate that out. Now, the hydrologists can model and show the level of inundation for each of those storage areas for each of those floods. And so in some cases, yes, the tracts of land on the outside boundary of where the water is inundated would be those that would be the most suspect to that particular question. But all of those tracts that are subsequently fully inundated, that would become a moot point.
All right, Mary. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks, Roger. Does anyone else have any questions, and especially anyone that's engaged in crop production? Jenny or John, anyone have anything that they'd like clarified? Or Eric, if you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, this is Eric. I guess the only thing I might just add, and perhaps this was mentioned previously, but I'll share it again. The base study that Dean and his team presented last month was something that the Diversion Authority had asked NDSU to produce originally back several years ago. And the most recent version, of course, was updated to reflect today's project and the information that we know about the project today. Today's presentation on the prevent plant risk was an additional study effort that we asked the NDSU team to analyze in response to comments and questions from the co-op businesses that operate in the staging area. They had some concerns about the potential for a sort of massive prevent plant risk, and obviously that would impact the producers, but not only the producers, it would impact the ag businesses that make a business or make their living by selling fertilizer and selling seed, and then also hauling grain that gets harvested. And so this study was really done in response to those comments and questions and concerns. And so hopefully that we're finding that we're trying to be responsive to those concerns and bring forward some factual information that can help answer the questions and concerns.
I think, Eric, one thing driving that concern is if you look at this chart again, over the last 9 years, we've experienced during flood years a substantial amount of acreage that has been PP. So from the input suppliers perspective, they're already up against a difficult situation each time it floods. We have a number of lands that do not get planted. These, of course, are county-wide numbers. The staging area is a relatively small portion of the overall size of these counties, but looking at these numbers, these translate into thousands and thousands of acres of PP when you look at it across the 4-county area. So their concern is justified that, would the diversion make an already difficult situation much worse?
Very good. Nancy or Salim, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I don't. I think Dean, got her through and got her on time. So,
Salim, what about you? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dean and Salim and Nancy. Really appreciate all your hard efforts on this. Great presentation. And as we mentioned, as Eric mentioned, this will be on our website to take a deeper dive and share with others if you care to. So thank you so much. And also thank you very much to the Outreach Committee for joining us today. You can hang around if you'd like, or go back to whatever it was you were doing before, but be well. And so with that, we will move on to item number 5, property acquisition status report. Eric.
Yeah, I just, before I do that, Roger, did you want to adjourn the outreach committee, or do you want us to just proceed?
Yes, I would like to ask for a motion to adjourn the outreach committee.
John Strand, I so move.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second?
Councilmember Carlson, second.
Okay, was that Councilmember Carlson?
Correct.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All not in favor, say aye. Motion carried. That works, Mary. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I will proceed then with the property status report. You have this on page 8 of your packet. Also trying to share it on the screen for those of you that are able to view the screen. Usual monthly report showing the status. We are over, I guess, just about 360 parcels that we've acquired, and we're continuing to make progress. As usual, we add a small handful of acquisitions each month, and we're continuing to do that. But again, at the same time, we do have a growing number of negotiations that seem to be stalling out. And so we've been working real closely with the Cass County Joint Board, Roger and his other members there. And as some of you are aware, the statutory process in North Dakota does also require us to engage the Cass County Commission. And so Monday of this week, we did give a brief update to the County Commission and had some dialogue with them about the process. And unfortunately, it appears that, while we're expending all efforts we can to avoid having to file for quick take, it looks like we will undoubtedly have to make some more of those filings. And so in the coming months, that'll likely be coming up. And so we shared that news with the Cass County Commission. The rest of the status report just goes through the normal pages. I certainly encourage you to take a look at that and see the progress that we're making. On the screen, I'm showing page 11, which is the environmental monitoring area. This was a pretty monumental effort. Originally there was over 400 parcels. That's been whittled down a little bit to about 375. And we have successfully negotiated access agreements on about 325 of those parcels. And so there's about 50 that are outstanding. We do have some court hearings that have been successful to get a few of these last rights of entries. Unfortunately, there was a couple of court hearings that got postponed because of the COVID-19 issues. And so we are working closely with the Corps of Engineers to try to encourage them to complete as much of the monitoring that they're able to with the access agreements that we have on, again, 325 plus parcels as we speak. On the channel, I guess, continuing to make some progress moving forward with those. That's really a big focus area. Another focus area that we've been working on is the Southern Embankment Reach 1. And so that's on page 14 of your packet. Also showing here on the screen, we are negotiating quite a bit with the property owners in Southern Embankment Reach 1. The goal was to have those acquired by mid-September. It appears that we're running a little bit behind schedule on being able to get that completed. And so we're coordinating, making sure the Corps is aware of those dates as we progress through the process. Otherwise, I guess I'd stand for any questions on the status report.
Thank you. Questions for Eric on the status? Are we going to be on time?
We're making good progress. One of the challenges that we found is the statutory requirement requires us to get a confirmation of receipt when we send letters to property owners. And some property owners have been resisting, signing for their mail, or they've been, avoiding the service officers. And so we've run across some delays in part of that ability for us to serve those property owners. And so we're, trying to navigate through that and use commercial delivery and other mechanisms as possible. In some situations, when we've exhausted all of our options, we've filed an affidavit of non-found. And so basically we've exhausted all sorts of options to contact these people. And, they've been elusive or not willing to respond. And so we had to resort to filing these affidavits. So that's added a bit more time to our process than we had originally anticipated. And so because of that, there are some areas where we are falling behind schedule. And again, we're hoping that we're able to negotiate all of these in a voluntary standpoint, which is certainly the quickest and easiest. And so I guess I'm not ready to panic yet, but we are very closely monitoring them.
And speaking of voluntary, have you had any just voluntary acquisitions? Are you working on very many of those folks that are just simply ready to move on and you're the best buyer out there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always been and continues to be a handful of property owners who are reaching out and asking to get started early or asking, to proceed with the acquisition process. And so generally what we've found is it's better to buy something when somebody's willing to sell. And so we like that opportunity to work with property owners when they're ready to sell, and especially if that happens ahead of the schedule that we have in front of us. Yeah.
Great. Questions or comments for Eric on the acquisition status? Then let's move on to the, I believe you must have more for the biogeomonitoring, item D, page 18.
Yeah, up on the screen on page 18 in your packet is a one-page matrix showing those biogeo acquisition status. I mentioned this earlier. We have about 50 that are outstanding. This report was produced about a week ago, and every day we're making more and more progress. Just yesterday, in fact, we have asked the Buffalo Watershed District to help reach out to a few property owners in Wilkin County. And just yesterday, the Buffalo Red Water District manager provided me with a copy of 2 signed rights of entries in Wilkin County. And so, those efforts were, like I said before, we're trying to exhaust all of our efforts to get these rights of entry secured. And so we are making progress. And so this matrix just shows you kind of the status as of last, I'll say tax day in the normal year, April 15th.
Great, thank you. Questions from anyone or comments? Then let's go on to the draft farmstead relocation plan.
Sure, thank you. Also starting in your packet here on page 19 is a presentation called the Rural Impact Mitigation Program. As you may recall, we've been working on the plan and policy for relocating and purchasing and relocating and reestablishing farmsteads that are impacted by the project. And this presentation talks about farmsteads. Please note that it would also apply to any other non-residential property, such as a rural business, for example. This program was modeled after a successful program that was developed in the Sauk Rapids area in Minnesota. That program was developed as a result of a bridge project where the bridge went over a river and then it landed in the middle of downtown Sauk Rapids and was going to impact a bunch of businesses from their downtown area. And the community wanted to incentivize those businesses to relocate and reestablish someplace in downtown. And so they could keep them in their community, if you will. And so they developed what was called a downtown impact mitigation program. And I guess we've taken some of the successes of that program and incorporate that into here. And so what we're proposing, and there's a lot of words on here, but I'll try to give you the high points of this, is that we know there's going to be a handful of farmsteads and businesses that are impacted and displaced by the project. And this program aims to help those businesses reestablish so that we are not harming sort of that economic vitality that they bring to the community. This program would be for situations where there is not a suitable replacement site available for those displaced businesses. And this program recognizes that the market value that we establish through an appraisal, otherwise known as the just compensation, that value is likely not sufficient to help these businesses rebuild a new site for their business. And so this rural impact mitigation compensation is aimed to assist them in covering that gap between the cost of a replacement site and the payment that they would receive for just compensation. It's recognized that in addition to this program, there are benefits eligible to these displaced property owners through the Uniform Relocation Act, and this program in no way supersedes or removes those benefits that they are going to be awarded. Some additional details here, in order to be eligible, the property owner must either operate a business, farm, or nonprofit from the displaced site to be eligible for those payments. We also recognize that there are situations where, say, for example, there's a family farm that may still be owned by the father or the grandfather, but the son or the daughter or the younger siblings are actually operating the business. And so there's a situation where you have a displaced landlord and a displaced tenant. And in this situation, what we're suggesting is that the displaced landlord must make reasonable efforts to accommodate the displaced tenants to be eligible, so that they're eligible for the payments made through this program. This was something that certainly came up in that Sauk Rapids example where there was landlords and tenants, and we want to make sure that the business that's being displaced, whether they're owning their land or whether they're just renting their space, making sure that they're incentivized to continue to operate. And then one other provision here that we think is important, recognizing that we are using taxpayer dollars to help rebuild these farmsteads or businesses. What we're proposing is that we would have a forgivable loan component. And this suggestion here is that it would be a 10-year period, and the loan amount would be fixed at full value for the first 5 years, and then reduced at 20% per year for the next 5 years. And again, the thought there is that we're essentially using taxpayer dollars to help reestablish a business, and we want that business to be successful, but we also want that business to stay in business, stay operating. So we avoid the scenario where we build a shiny new farmstead for somebody and 6 months later they turn around and sell it and have all the profit. We're trying to avoid that situation. We're really trying to make sure these businesses stay in operation. When we did discuss this provision with the Cass County Joint Water Resource District, there was some comments that it's likely that some of the displaced farmsteads, the owners or the operators of those farmsteads are intending to pass on their business to the next generation, or retire at some point within this 10-year period. And so I think there are some options for this loan to be transferable. And I had a brief discussion with Mr. Shockley the other day, and the suggestion was perhaps it's transferable to family members or people that are perhaps part of the business today. But if they're just going to sell it to on the open market or something, then the loan would likely not be transferable. So certainly open to feedback on that provision, but that's the general thought. For your awareness on some numbers, there are...
Eric, I have a question.
Yep.
Sorry, I wasn't on mute. how do we guarantee that? I mean, I understand that, it's part of the discussion, but I just don't even understand how you can begin to guarantee what someone would do with it going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I would anticipate that we would sign an agreement. I guess the details of this do need to be worked out. I have talked to Mr. Shockley, and he's informed me that he's been involved with several of these type of forgivable loan programs. And so there's some successful history recently in the local area with using this type of model. And so I guess the exact details of that agreement need to be ironed out. But I guess in my mind, we would have an agreement with the displaced property owner that lays out the terms and conditions of the forgivable loan, and assuming that if they're operating a farmstead today, and assuming that they continue to operate the new or just the reestablished farmstead for a period of time, then the loan would be forgiven, and sort of in a ratcheted or step down type fashion.
Eric, this is Roger.
Yep.
The loan would cover what part of the transition here? Certainly not all costs.
Right. Yeah, maybe I'll get to that here in another slide that shows how there's really three components of the acquisition here, and the loan would only cover above and beyond the just compensation amount. So let me get through the numbers here, and we'll jump to that question. So just from a number standpoint, there are 16 farmsteads that we're showing that are impacted by the project to one degree or another. There are also 9 commercial properties that we know of today. Some of those are utilities, which likely wouldn't be mitigated through this program. We've been using a memorandum of understandings for the utilities. Here's a map that may be a little bit hard to read on the screen here, but basically you can see that there's kind of a tan shading showing where the mitigation boundary is, and several of these farmsteads are on the southern edge of that mitigation boundary. And our hope is that we won't have to buy out or remove some of these farmsteads that are on the fringe. We're hoping that the impacts are minor enough that we can mitigate those in place, but then some of these other farmsteads that are up closer to the Camel Hump area and sort of in the heart of the staging area, those are undoubtedly going to have to be a buyout, and so they would of course be eligible for this program. Here's the slide that maybe addresses Roger's question. So we know that there are the standard Uniform Relocation Act basically requires us to conduct an appraisal, and that appraisal establishes what's called just compensation for the existing real property. And so that would be cash paid to the property owner, and that cash then could presumably be used as a down payment for reconstruction of the new site. In addition to that, all of the personal property and some usual business reestablishment costs are covered underneath standard provisions of the Uniform Relocation Act. And so this would include moving all of the personal property from one site to another, which you can imagine in a farmstead, there's going to be quite a bit of personal property. And then the third component, what we're talking about today, is this rural impact mitigation program. And this is really talking about helping really establish that business, and based on the determination of something that's functionally equivalent to the current business operation. And what I mean by that, functionally equivalent, is, for example, many of these farmsteads have been built and added on to over 40, 50 years or maybe more. And they have a variety of grain bins, for example, that were added on over time. And so collectively, maybe the farmstead has, 50,000 bushels of grain storage in 12 different grain bins. But if you were to rebuild that grain storage today, it's likely that you wouldn't build 12 separate small grain bins. You would build 3 or 4 larger grain bins. to come up with the same volume of grain storage. And so that would be considered functionally equivalent. And so the program then would provide revenue through this forgivable loan program to rebuild the functionally equivalent farmstead and replace the grain storage. And similarly, it would replace the, perhaps the square footage of shop space or cold storage or those other components that, again, from a market value and an appraised value, probably are appraised at a very low cost or low value. But of course, those features in a farmstead are very functional and very important for the farmstead to operate. And so the loan amount would be tied to this RAMP payment, which again is based on the functional equivalent. What we've indicated here is that we would work with farm or business specialists to help establish what is considered functionally equivalent and come up with the cost of those functional equivalents. We've had several discussions about how best to do this. We've had discussions with the NDSU extension staff. We've also been looking into the extension information that's provided by other land grant universities, Wisconsin, Minnesota, et cetera. And we're starting to have some conversations with some of the farm building suppliers like Gateway Building Systems, Superior Grain Bins. They all supply this type of farm equipment, and we're going to be working towards building a rate sheet that would essentially identify what the costs of those components are, and then we can sort of build up a cost estimate based on that rate sheet for each one of the impacted farmsteads. So from a hypothetical example, just to show you on a high level how the math might work out, if we have a farmstead that is impacted, we do an appraisal. And in this case, just for discussion, I said, well, the farmstead the appraised value is $500,000, which again is going to be based on a market value and a depreciation value of that farmstead. And so we know that that's going to be less than the cost to replace that. And so we do a functionally equivalent replacement cost. And for discussion's sake, let's say that that's $900,000. In addition to the buildings, there's going to be some site improvements. This could be utilities, it could be gravel, it could be other drainage, other improvements that need to be made at the new site. And so collectively, that's $970,000. They would use the $500 as a down payment, and so the estimated subsidy through this RAMP program would be $475,000. I'm going to pause there, I guess, just with one more comment. This is marked draft. As you can see on the slides here, we're starting to circulate this concept and gathering feedback. One of the pieces of feedback that we got from the Cass County Joint Water Resource District was that we should probably discuss this concept with some ag bankers and understand how the forgivable loan and those assets might be portrayed on a balance sheet, for example, for the farmsteads and for those who own it. So we have not yet talked to the ag bankers on this subject. We have had multiple conversations with ag bankers in the past about various issues, and so that's one action item we still need to do.
Questions from anybody at this point?
Hey, sure, this is Bob. I have one question. Eric, when I looked at this the first time and on that particular slide, I asked myself, where's the URA relocation reestablishment benefits? But now that you've gone through it, correct me if I'm wrong, but that really isn't relevant to this because that's a reimbursement for expenses incurred, right?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, maybe a point of clarification. So the uniform relocation benefits in the middle box here on this slide, those are paid through a reimbursement. And so if we have to move personal property, for example, from one site to another, there's costs that get incurred with that moving. Perhaps the moving even includes temporary storage of grain, all sorts of different provisions that might come into play. Those would be reimbursed, and those would be reimbursed at actual costs. And so that really doesn't hit that hypothetical example. I suppose you could show it as an in and an out, but for simplicity's sake, I chose not to show it at all. Similarly, the RIMP payment would be eligible for costs applied or cost incurred for the new business. And we would, of course, require some documentation. If we're going to give somebody this loan or these dollars to rebuild a farmstead, we want to make sure that those dollars are in fact going to rebuild a farmstead and not used on a vacation home or whatever example you want to pick out.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions? Go ahead and continue, Eric.
Okay, well, that was all I really had about this. I guess if you have other comments or questions, certainly fire them our way. I would, we are dealing with a few farmsteads today that have, started more of a early acquisition, and we do have some commercial businesses as well that we're dealing with. And so our goal is to get this model approved as soon as possible. I know we have the action item to figure out the exact agreement, and I'll work with Mr. Shockley on that. And then also we have this conversation with the ag bankers. But I'm hoping to get all that stuff done in the next month so that we can come back and ask for approval of this plan, and if there's any tweaks or adjustments that are necessary.
Madam
Great.
Chair,
Yes.
John Strand, a question I'm just curious about is, maybe it doesn't fit here, is I'm wondering about tax implications to farmers and landowners and property owners who may have a taking or may sell under duress. Are there any tax breaks for them, or are they going to get hit with the same capital gains and other taxes? Because if land has been in the family for generations, there might be a very immense tax consequence to selling it, which often they don't want to ever do.
Yeah, two comments on that. Anytime somebody does have capital gains, of course, there's the 1099 issue, and I think those are tax laws that we have to abide by. And so if somebody, does have a capital gain through the sale of real property, then, they would be getting the 1099 and having those tax implications. All that being said, in nearly all of our acquisitions, we've been including the provisions of tax code 1031 and 1033, which basically provides those property owners more time to reinvest those proceeds into a other real estate holding or some type of other holding that could avoid the tax implications that you speak of. And so I think we have been as flexible as we can be given that situation, but otherwise, yes, there is some tax implications for purchasing of personal property. In these situations here, where we're talking about reestablishing a farmstead, I think the idea is that any of those proceeds would go back into the new farmstead. So the tax consequence would, be kicked down the road until they decide to sell it to somebody else in the future.
Commissioner Strand, this is Chris McShane. One of the other things to keep in mind is that URA payments are entirely tax-free. So while the sale of the land, the just compensation, would have a tax consequence that can be mitigated by buying replacement property through 1033, which gives them 2 years. The URA payment would be completely tax-free. The RIMP payment, I'm not sure how that would work. That's something that I haven't looked at. Maybe somebody else has.
And in North Dakota, at least, if it's farm property, it would not be subject to the farmstead should not be subject to the increase in property taxes. Correct?
Commissioner Sherlin, that is correct with respect to the farmstead and some of the acreage that's connected to that. To the extent that it is for the farming operation and connected to it. But that doesn't mitigate the income tax side of it.
Correct. And just, you know, as in Oxbow, for example, when there were improvements when people moved, their property values went up, and so therefore their property taxes went up. So people would need to be aware of that, so they wouldn't be surprised, because it would be an improvement.
Commissioner Sherlin, this is Chris McShane again. The other thing with that is, to the extent it is a homestead, there wouldn't even be any capital gain on that at all, because of the purchase of the homestead, and you'd have to have a pretty significant gain on that before you can before you'd have to recognize any capital gain.
Great. Okay.
That's right.
Whoever just did something to their microphone, it really improved the sound. I think maybe that was Eric, but it could be wrong. Anyway, because there's been some background all along. So thanks for that. Okay, anything else, Commissioner Strand?
Not at the moment, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Eric, anything else on this topic?
I'm sorry that my microphone is causing problems. I'm supposed to be getting some new equipment from our IT guys, but nothing else on this topic. I can proceed to the next one if you're ready.
Okay. Just a reminder, please, anyone on the committee to reach out, or, you know, if you're not on the committee, just reach out to Eric and myself, because now is the time to, you know, to let your thoughts be known on this. We do want to proceed with it, so that everybody's being treated equally. Okay, then let's just move on to the crop insurance product development proposal.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, again. In your packet is a proposal from a company called Watts and Associates. It starts on page 27 of your packet. Also have it on the screen here. As some of you may recall, we had actually worked with Watts and Associates back in 2013 and 2014. They helped identify some potential solutions for mitigating the ag impacts in the staging area. And we've been in contact with Watts from time to time over the years, and more recently reached out to Watts because we knew that we needed to put more details on the summer crop loss program that was conceptualized in our mitigation plan, and also recognized that the permit from the DNR requires us to have these details developed 3 years prior to completion of the project. And so, you know, that's still a few years away, but recognizing that development of these crop programs are important, and it's something we've committed to. And so recently we reached out to Watts and Associates, and we've been doing some back and forth with them over the past month or so, trying to get this proposal developed. This has been reviewed and presented to Joel and Roger and myself and John Shockley and probably a couple others. And so what we have here today is the proposal from Watts and Associates. I'll give a few high points on that. I also want the Land Committee to know that this proposal is also part of a contract that is being presented to the Finance Committee later today for approval. And so we're hoping that the Land Committee will support the recommendation to proceed with contracting Watts for this work. In summary, the proposal here looks to add more detail again to the concept of providing a summer crop loss program. And if you recall, the risk of the likelihood of the project operating in the summer is extremely low. There has not been a flood event in history that would have caused operation of the project on growing crops. But all that being said, if the project would operate on growing crops, those producers would not be eligible for federal crop insurance. And so they'd be stuck, sort of high and dry or whatever, low and wet, I guess would maybe be the analogy, and not have a safety blanket. And so because that consequence of that would be extreme and severe on those producers, the Diversion Authority had committed to providing an insurance product for those summer flood events. And so we've been talking with Watts. They've come up with a 2-phase approach to solving how we would basically produce a rider that would be offered to those producers on an annual basis, just like they sign up for regular crop insurance today. Phase 1 of this is really adding on to the administrative framework that's available today for producers. There's a reinsurer that goes out and meets with all the producers on a regular basis. They sign up for their crop insurance provisions. And so there's all this structure in place. And phase 1 basically looks to solidify that structure for the purposes of our project. And then phase 2 adds to the work in phase 1 and develops the actual rider that would be an agreement between the producers and the Diversion Authority. And that rider or that agreement does need to get reviewed and approved by the Risk Management Agency. And so there's some timeframes involved with that. After this proposal was included in your packet, we have asked Watts to include some interim deliverables. And so they are working on a tweak of this proposal to incorporate those interim deliverables, basically kind of a go, no go, as well as some financial information about both the summer flood program and looking at a prevent plant model that ties in with the discussion we had earlier today. So I guess I'll maybe pause there, see if there's any comments or questions. Again, I know Roger was involved in this and shared some inputs through that process.
Thank you. Roger, do you have anything to add or?
I think this is a good step forward, and I would highly recommend that the Land Committee recommend or to the Finance Committee to accept this proposal and get Watson Associates going on this.
Great. Any questions or comments from anyone? Is that a motion then, Roger?
That would be a motion.
Great. Is there a second?
This is Corey. I'll second.
Thank you, Mayor. Any further discussion? Then I'll take a roll call on this, please.
Roger?
Yes.
Corey?
Yes.
Nathan?
Yes.
Dwayne? I'm sorry, Kevin? He was also absent. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Bruce?
Yes.
Kevin's there, I believe.
Okay, Jenny? Jenny Manju? Mary Sherling?
Yes.
John Strand?
Yes.
Bob Zimmerman?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Anything else before we move on, Eric?
Nothing else on
Mary,
that.
this is Mary.
Thank you.
Kevin.
Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I've been having some trouble getting connected. For a while I was muted somehow, but I just want to make sure my vote was casted as a yes.
Okay. Duly noted.
I'll put down.
Okay, great. All right, then let's move on to item number 9. The committee update to the DA board.
Yeah, I guess just for this group's consideration, I did include 2 slides, one just a cover slide, and then the next page just showing the one-page update that we would propose to share with the diversion board tomorrow as part of the committee update.
And when do you plan to share the other items that we've discussed as far as the ag risk prevent plant study and then also the farmstead relocation plan? When will that go to the full board?
What I was anticipating is that tomorrow, under the land committee portion of the agenda, we could share this information that's on the screen, as well as the 1-pager from the NDSU study, which again was actually 2 pages. That is in their packet. The NDSU team will be available tomorrow during the board meeting if there's any comments or questions. Otherwise, it was suggested that we could just sort of give a brief update about the ag risk study and let the board know that it's available on the website. Regarding the Watts proposal that will be presented through the finance committee this afternoon, and then assuming that the finance committee goes along with your recommendation, that'll carry over to the board. And then regarding the farmstead relocation program, I guess what I would envision is that if there's any feedback between now and next month, we'll incorporate that, as well as the feedback we have about talking to ag bankers, and then bring that forward next month for the board's blessing.
Very good. Okay. Then how about an update from the CAS joint board? I don't know if Dan's there or somebody else going to do that.
It's Roger.
Okay.
We continue. Eric gave a good overall view of what's been going on with the land, and just really we just continue to go forward, and we know as we get some of these lands are going to be hard to purchase, but we're doing everything we can to negotiate and to be fair, friendly, and flexible. And yeah, we want to stay out of court as much as we can. So we'll continue to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you. And as Eric mentioned, we did get an update from Eric and who else was there, Eric, at our commission meeting?
Sean Fredericks.
Sean, yes, Sean was there. And so we got a good rundown and a reminder of how the Cass County Commission will be engaged in this portion of it. And unfortunately, that's part of how we do things in North Dakota these days anyway. So very good. Then let's move on to Kevin. Do you have a report for the Minnesota side?
Mary, we do not meet until tomorrow.
Then perhaps you could just give a brief report at the DA meeting tomorrow.
Will do.
Okay. Anything from MetroCog?
Hi, Madam Chair. This is Adam Altenberg for MetroCog.
Hi, Adam.
Hi. I do have an update here. I'll try to be brief. I have a slide. Let's see if I can bring this up. Can you see that all right?
I don't see anything. I see you.
Okay. I'll skip that then for now. So I think at our previous meeting, the last time we checked in, we were in the process of putting together a benefits case for the recreational components of the rec plan that we're working on. and talking about how the different nodes and trails would translate into what we were estimating at about $101 million in visitor spending that could be recaptured in the region. About 17.5 million in day and overnight visitor spending, as well as increased health and business attractiveness in the region. I think also this last time that we checked in, we talked about our continuing discussions on several governance structures and who might be best in place to be the primary point of contact with the P3 developer to provide that initial vision and stewardship for the different recreational components. In the months since, we've continued to work on the plan. Part of this has included conversations with the cities, park districts, and other interests, other entities to kind of gauge their interest or capacity to help with different elements of future recreational components. I think the general consensus, specifically from the park districts and North Dakota Parks and Rec, is cautious interest in assisting with one or several nodes. We also had a talk with Met Council, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization in the Twin Cities, which is responsible for the planning of 56 regional parks and I believe about 400 miles of regional trails, kind of to better understand their role and their relationship with the partnering cities and counties, as well as several special districts down there. Another thing that we've talked about is branding. We discussed naming and branding with our project study review committee. Part of this is better to discern or differentiate the rec component from the diversion's purpose of flood protection. And of the, I believe, 6 names that we presented, the one that our project committee selected was the Agassiz Greenway. So that's the name that we've been using for this project since February. Promotional videos. We've been working on one of possibly 2 promotional videos for this project. Originally, our intent was to do a short 4 to 5 minute video that would include project details, as well as testimonials from different leaders in the community. Basically similar to the 3 questions videos that have been put out by the Diversion Authority over the years. As of now, we're currently working on one video that focuses solely on the project and talks about some of the benefits, kind of that benefits case that we talked about earlier. But our hope is to still do another video that would include testimonials from different leaders in the community, hopefully to better build enthusiasm for some of the rec features, but we're still deciding how best to move forward with that. Last 2 items, the draft plan. MetroCog did receive the first of several draft iterations of the Recreation Master Plan just yesterday. We're doing a quick internal review of the sections completed thus far. After that, we hope to share it with the executive director and the Jacobs team before moving on and sharing it with the rest of our project study review committee. And last on my list is public inputs. Our plan is still to do another round of public input for this plan. Originally, we looked at different opportunities for pop-up events in May and June. We're probably not going to go forward with that, but we'll likely look to solicit input online and maybe reaching out to our jurisdictions and other project partners to help spread the word, whatever that public input looks like. That is all I have in brief. I believe our executive director, Cindy Gray, is also on the call here and this meeting here today too. If she has any words or if you have any questions for either of us, we'd be happy to take them at this time.
Great, thank you, Adam. Any questions for either Adam or Cindy? Well, I think enthusiasm for outdoor recreation is running pretty high right now, especially on a day like this when we're all inside, except I don't know if Rocky's inside or not, or he's got a fake background going there. But anyway, any questions? and it's called Agassiz Greenway. Is that my understanding?
Correct. That's the name that came up on top.
Okay, so we know what we're talking about when we hear that word. Great. Okay, thank you so much. Then we'll move on to any other business. We've got 3 minutes before finance kicks us out. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. If there is no other business, thank you so much, Eric, and again to NDSU and MetroCog and everyone that presented. Appreciate it. It was a full agenda. Appreciate everybody taking extra time today. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Roger moves.
Thank you. Is there a second, please?
Kevin.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All opposed, say aye. We are adjourned. I'll see some of you tomorrow. Stay well, everyone.